Indy Monumental Marathon. I ran it and I almost PR'd and I have some regrets. Legitimately. We're going to go through all of it. This is going to be a 2-part race breakdown. The first part is just the traditional race breakdown in the way I normally do it. And then the second part is going to be comparing Indianapolis to Chicago, all the different metrics. I'm going to break down every way I could think of, but I'm just going to jump right into the Indy breakdown. Indy was 27 days after Chicago Marathon. I was obviously in peak shape for Chicago. There are even feelings I have looking back at Chicago. I almost felt like my hidden gem half where I ran 1:12:24, I believe. I felt like I was even in better shape then than I was in Chicago. There's a bunch of variables with it because it felt like hidden gem was the perfect weather. It was about 50 degrees that morning with no humidity, but Chicago, as you all know, was more in like the mid 50s, touching to 60 at the end with high humidity. And so I think that really did affect it. I'm going to get into that, into the breakdown there. But I wanted to change things and change variables in Indy to see, almost just kind of test the waters on what might result in something different, get me as close as I can to a PR, or getting as close as I could to breaking 232, that initial goal. I think in the back of my head from the start of it, I didn't think that breaking 232 was possible here, given the fact that I only got up to maybe like 45 miles on the biggest week after Chicago. I took it really slow, kind of building back up and then sort of tapering back down. A month turnaround is like the most unideal way to race another marathon. I'm fully convinced that the fastest way to race a marathon is to do a proper build, taper the correct way, and all that good stuff. Now there's variables, right? Like Indy might have been cooler, which it was, and I figured it would be. And so it was like, well, maybe we can work with these variables to try to get a faster time, even though I'm not in peak shape. And the result really reflected like a really positive outcome, one that I'm very encouraged by and really excited for moving forward. With Indy, my carb load was totally different. In Chicago, I really wanted to hit that around 800 grams per day, and doing that model of 7 to 9 grams of carbs per pound of body weight. And I was really meticulous with it, and I tried to hack the system with doing orange juice and apple juice. And I did orange juice the 2 days leading up to Hidden Gem, and that was really beneficial for me. That carb load seemed to really work with running the fastest half I ever have by a lot, and getting the marathon equivalent of under a 2:32 with that time. I wanted to double down and do even more before Chicago. So I did a full carton of orange juice and a full carton of apple juice each day leading up to Chicago. Now, in hindsight, that wasn't the best move because I had stomach issues in Chicago, and it could have very well been because of that, because I consumed too much fructose. A lot of people were saying that in the comments, messaging me, it's just too much fructose. And I figured I'd be okay because I managed it well within that half, but it seemed to be that doubling down wasn't the best move and just made me feel too full. I think that was in combination with eating my dinner too late the night before Chicago. So I made sure to eat really early. We went to P.F. Chang's the night before. It was super fun. Clark and his girlfriend Jacqueline and Cyrus and I just didn't track anything. So I made sure to eat a lot of bagels. I did do a bunch of orange juice 2 days out. I did a little bit the day before. Made sure to drink G1M Sport and bread. And I did lo mein at P.F. Chang's. So, relatively just a lot of carbs, but I probably only hit around 500 grams each day around there, as what I would guess. The other caveat to this situation is that we had a massive Airbnb issue. We got there and realized our Airbnb wasn't cleaned. So that really threw a wrench in the weekend, and that made sleep a bit less comfortable because we're like, are these sheets clean? And I don't know if they were. I just tried to turn my brain off, and so we went to Target the second night, got some more blankets and stuff, and on the back half tried to get our refund, which we got like a 2/3 refund on the place, but it was not ideal. There was felt like a a dungeon basement with the light on. When we got there, Cyrus was like, "What's that?" It was this like mildewy basement with the light on. Yeah, so we were a bit freaked out. Not the best situation. Kind of making me feel like I need to do hotels from now on, to be honest, or just be very, very meticulous on reading reviews. Anyway, for breakfast the day of race, Indy, I ate it just shy of 2 hours before the race, which I think I also realized in this race was too close to race start. In Chicago, I did about 3 hours before, 3.5 hours before. I think that's the sweet spot for me. Even if that means getting up at an ungodly hour, doing that to consume the breakfast early enough. There's also a part of me that feels like I might be better off eating less of a breakfast, maybe half of a bagel and a Go Bar instead of a full bagel, Go Bar, and G&M Sport. Like all of those things felt like I was too full at the start line, even though I wanted to get all that last stuff in to be topped up on fuel. I also pulled out a fat Sharpie and put down all the splits for what would be a 5:45 per mile pace for the whole first half of the race. So I did a 5K split, a 10K split, a 10-mile split, and a halfway split. And all those were very clear, and it was super helpful in the race because I was not manually splitting my miles in this race like I normally do. This was a variable I wanted to change to go way more off of feel than meticulously analyzing every split and how I'm speeding up or slowing down throughout the race. I took a caffeinated Go Gel 30 minutes prior to race. Again, my stomach already felt kind of full, so that didn't feel great going down that early, which that was just another indicator that the breakfast was too much, and I need to be more meticulous about that in the future because, again, my stomach felt unsettled in this race. That's obviously a normal thing that's a thing that I deal with normally. You guys have obviously seen me like puke in training runs and have upset stomachs, but I've never experienced an upset stomach the way I did in Chicago and Indy in any other race before. So yeah, I feel like it's because I am consuming too many carbs, and I almost feel like I need to find this really good middle ground with eating a light breakfast morning of the race. I think I'm 13 marathons into the game. I'm still learning so much about dialing this stuff in, but I think it's really important for these faster paces where you are just absolutely figuring out what your red line is and what you are capable of. So through the whole first half, or at least through 8 miles, I saw that I was running about 5:47 to 5:48 per mile. And I didn't realize at the moment, I have my Pace 3, which is what I wore on the race. I now have the Pace Pro I'm testing out now, but I've been rocking the Pace 3 all year long. Absolutely love that watch. I had it on the face that did average elapsed mile pace time. So I was interpreting it as, I'm still currently running 5:48. But I would see that throughout the race start to drift. Like it went from 5:47 to 5:48 to 5:49. And it wasn't until about mile 10 when I realized like, oh, hello, this is the average of all of my miles. So then I actually saw that as a good thing because I was like, okay, well, if I'm under 5:52, and this doesn't go above 5:52, I'm very close to PR. Because I wasn't feeling great at 5:47, 5:48 pace. Now, the reality here was I wasn't running tangents as well as I was in Chicago. Chicago, my readout on my final distance was 26.25, I believe. And if I look on Coros for Indy, I was at 26.45. So let me just screen record so you can see some of these data points. I wasn't running tangents as well on this course as I was in Chicago, which meant that it was reading my mile pace about 2 seconds faster than what I was actually doing. And that was confirmed with every time I passed the 5K marker, the 10K marker, I noticed that I really wasn't anywhere near the Sharpie points on my wrist. I remember I had like 17:52, I believe, for the 5K, and I went through the actual 5K marker in about 18:10, I believe. So I knew that it wasn't on 5:45 pace, but I wasn't doing the math in my head in the moment thinking, oh, this is so far off. Because then I really realized it at the halfway point where I went through in 1:16:31, but that was almost identical to my Chicago half split. So I felt relatively at that point that was fine. I started spacing out gels early because of, me feeling too full, like I said, and my stomach feeling weird again. I actually went with the new flavor of G1M Sport in the orange flavor, which I've been loving. And I had it in, my Nathan Soft Flask like I normally do. I had no idea that the first half of this race, I did prior, I knew we'd be running with half marathoners, but I completely spaced out that was the case. And I was kind of shocked at how many people there were running around a 2:33 marathon pace. And I knew that the female course record was 2:36, and there was a female runner that was outpacing me the whole first 6 miles. And I was like, I knew Lindsay was, just came out of nowhere. I knew Lindsay, Jeff's athlete on Bat City Track Club, was in this race, and I knew she was trying to go for around 2:30. So I was kind of blown away that there was another female running around a 2:33 marathon pace. And then I realized at about mile 7 when I overtook her that she was half marathon. And somebody else confirmed that. It was a guy who follows the channel, and I was like, what are you going for today? And he's like, 1:16. And I was like, oh yeah. So I realized then by mile 8, everyone split off, and then I was completely alone. And I think that was the story of Indy, is that it was a sufferfest in that it was yet really hard, but it was nowhere near Chicago or any other world major where you have people to work with at the pace that I run. And I was literally alone the rest of the race. I didn't work side by side really with anybody for more than half a mile, from mile 8 to the end. So that was really hard. A lot of head games, and that whole first half, there were definitely some headwinds, and I just kept telling myself, okay, well, I know this is sort of an out and back course going north and coming back south, so we shouldn't have any headwinds coming back. We'll have a tailwind, and I'll be able to ride that with being fatigued. Surprise, surprise, there was an even stronger headwind on the way back, which was super, super fun. But yeah, the effort started to feel too hard. It could have been because I was alone. Maybe I would have been able to maintain closer to the 5:45 mile pace if I had someone pacing that with me and just mentally there with me doing that. I saw my buddy Scotty at 10, which was super fun, and a light spot, but he asked me, how you doing? And even at 10, I was like, I feel terrible. This is going to be a really hard day. I told Cyrus that at mile 4. I knew it was going to be a grind, and it was because of that stomach stuff again. There were small rolling hills through 19. From half to 19, it's not entirely flat. It's a relatively flat course. I believe there's only about 350-ish feet of elevation, which is just a bit more than Chicago, maybe 100, 150 feet more than Chicago. But there are a couple spots where you have to climb, and doing that alone, it's a grind, especially with a bit of a headwind too. And then on this course, there are potholes, and there are places where it's not paved super well, so you have to make sure that your footing is good. And I got past a few times before the half, and that felt a bit deflating because it felt like I was already starting to fade and that the second half was going to be a disaster. And so, yeah, I crossed in 1:16:31. I only had 3 gels in by mile 15. And at that point at 16, I ditched the handheld to Cyrus because I was thinking if I take any more of this, I think I am going to puke. And so it was just this game of try to get as much fuel as you can in without spewing it. And it was that balance, knowing that I was carb loaded. This will probably still be enough, even though ideally I would like to get 1.5 times as much as I'm getting in now. There was more crowd support in this section from 15 to 19, but the rollers were just hard. 16 to 19 was a grind, headwinds again. I was passed by 2 more people, And I passed, it was kind of, I was passing people that were fading, other people were passing me, but at around 18, I got passed by a pack of like 8 guys, and that felt super deflating, but at least it gave me something to work off of moving there, because they didn't pass me super aggressively. And it then became a game of picking these guys off the next 5 miles. So I was slowly able to then like at least pick off half of that pack throughout the next 5 miles, which started to become a game and something I could work off of. And I started to feel a bit better. I think you could see on my splits, let me pull up my splits on Strava. Around that time, I was able to increase pace a bit, like through 17, 18, 19 to 20. I even dropped to 5:43 around mile 20 before starting to fade again between 21 to 26. So you could tell I was feeling motivated by passing those guys, but then it was really just kind of running on fumes after that point. I got one more gel in, probably around mile 20. And then that was my last one. I think I just committed to not taking any more at that point. Still was passing people here and there that were fading. But the other caveat was that there was 0 cramping in this one. And I knew I didn't want to be as aggressive as I was in Chicago, hitting like a 5:40 mile around mile 20. So I just kind of went to effort and stopped looking at my watch. It was saying now 5:51, 5:52. So I knew I was close to what could potentially be a PR still, and that's really what the game turned into. And that's where I feel like I have the regrets, because by mile 24 I switched my watch face for the first time to the current pace, which is on my second screen on my pace 3. So instead of average pace throughout the race, it then showed me my current pace, and I was running a 6 flat. And that's where I was like, oh, I thought I was running 5:50 right now, or at least around 5:48. And so that motivated me to push a bit more. You can kind of see in the splits after 23, 24, I ran a 5:54, but at that point it was too late. I don't think I had the ability to make up the 30 seconds I had lost from my PR time. So I started pushing, but there was only so much I could do to push at that point. So I really didn't know the PR wasn't possible until the final mile or two. So I think had I known I would have been that close around 20, I would have done whatever I could to shave off those 30 seconds. Who knows? I don't know if I would have been able to, honestly. But so it was good because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to race by feel. I didn't want to be meticulously checking my splits. But it was bad because if I had raced it like I normally do, I would have had a better indication of what my finish time would have been, and I would have been able to race smarter. And I was talking to some people post-race here, like it kind of felt like mental sabotage, because there was so much of me that believes that marathon racing should be done a certain way. Like you should be spending 3 to 4 months training, getting peaked, tapering down, like doing the thing. And that's how you get a PR. And there's a part of me mentally that felt like if you get a PR today, it's just going to feel like cheating in a way. Like it's going to feel like you cheated the system and you didn't do it the right way, which is so ridiculous. Obviously it was carrying fitness over from peak training. So that just felt silly, but it almost felt like a bit of self-sabotage. I don't know if you all can relate to that, but one really positive thing I can recall from this race is that not a single mile was above 6 minutes, which is really encouraging. I had 4 miles above 6 minutes in Chicago. So I raced the first half, the first 2/3 faster than Indy. But in Indy, I'd never dipped below that 6 minute mark, which means I really didn't fade very hard in the second half. If I split in 1:16.31 through half, and my finish time being 2:34.30, let's math it real quick. It's a minute and a half positive split. So not too bad. So yeah, tons of mixed feelings, really happy with that effort. Honestly, came away with a time that I thought was way better than I really in my head thought I was going to run like a 2:36 or 2:37, to be honest. And so to run under 2:35 2 times in a month was really encouraging. It just feels like all of my goals, like that was my goal for the spring and I'm hitting it in the fall. And it just almost feels like my goals have been getting delayed. But yeah, you can probably assume and know that I'm definitely going to be going for sub 230 by the spring, or at least a goal for all of next year. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to be chasing that. But I want to really compare and contrast Indy versus Chicago this year. I'm just going to go through all the different variables and what I learned with those variables changing things and what might have affected each race. In Indy, the temp started at 44 degrees and went to 52. Chicago started at 55 and went to 61. There were much more headwinds at Indy, and there were some headwinds in Chicago. Obviously, the carb load was 500 a day versus the 800 plus in Chicago with the fructose. But I had stomach issues in both, but Chicago was definitely more. Like, my stomach hurt in the first 7 miles of Chicago, whereas it felt uncomfortable in Indy. It felt like I couldn't consume more. It didn't hurt. I just felt uncomfortable, if that makes sense. Breakfast was 2 hours before in Indy versus the 3 hours in Chicago. Big difference. I know a lot of people are going to want to discuss, and I might make a whole video about this. I wore the Alpha Fly 3s in Chicago, and I wore my trusty Saucony Endorphin Elites in Indy. A lot of people were under the impression that I got calf cramps late in Chicago because of the Alpha Flies. I never thought that might be why I got calf cramps. I still don't want to attribute shoes to cramping, but I did not experience any calf cramps at all in Indy. I wasn't even close to calf cramping. So that could be a factor. It really, more than anything, just solidified that I think I want to move forward with racing in Saucony, if that's the experience, because, and I could break this down more in another video, the Alpha Flies are heavier, but there is that component of less of a heel on the Alpha Flies. And so that would be the argument that it forces you up on your toes more, which would cause more stress on the calves and cause them to cramp easier than if you had something like the Elites. Now, like, all my other PRs have been set in the Elites, and I ran Hidden Gem half in that shoe, and it's lighter. So that was interesting. At the very least, it was very interesting. So definitely something to consider moving forward. I think I was maybe a couple pounds heavier for Indy because my mileage was down. I wasn't coming off of 70, 80 miles a week. And I think I was really the lightest I had ever been as an adult through Hidden Gem in Chicago, around 155 pounds. I didn't weigh myself closer to Indy, but I assume I was closer to 160 going into Indy, so that's a factor as well. I only did 4 gels and maybe 6 ounces of G1M Sport within Indy, which is just not enough fuel. And I would have hoped for different, but I really wanted to avoid throwing up. And I definitely took more plain water in the second half, which is really interesting. I felt like I should have done that more in Chicago. I felt like I needed to do that more on my last workout before Chicago when I threw up. And so that's something I'm taking into future races, consuming more plain water in the last third of the race. Chicago, I did 5 gels with 14 ounces of G1M, so I was definitely fueled more. And that's what makes me think it wasn't a fueling issue for the cramping either. Because no cramping in Indy with less fuel. Yeah, the pacing, I did the rolling average thing in Indy. Part of me wants to actually run a marathon with just the heart rate screen on, because I will get to the heart rate difference, which is really fascinating. Because I know I have nothing really left at 172. And I never checked my heart rate in Indy, and I felt like if I had, I would have been encouraged to go faster. I would have mentally thought, oh, you have more to give, which is really interesting. Or maybe just turn the watch face off and just go and get the data later. I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there. And I was obviously alone most of the race in Indy, and I was running with people in Chicago. I feel like that alone could make up for 30 seconds. The elevation, based off of data I saw, was only about a 60-foot discrepancy between Indy and Chicago. We already touched on tangents. Is 26.45 in Indy and 26.25 in Chicago. Okay, so heart rate. I only touched 170 in Indy by mile 25, which is pretty wild. Like most of the race, I was between 164 to 167. And if I go into Koros here, there's no massive spike or anything. You can see on this downhill, it really came down. There was no uphill where it was getting into 170 or even high 160s. And so, yeah, you can see I'm really starting to work towards the end here at 2 hours, 20 minutes. This is the last few miles. I think that's when I started to realize I was running 6 flat pace and wanted to pick it up. But that's where I finally touched 170. You know, if we look at Chicago, and I'm certain that part of this has to do with the humidity on that day and being a bit warmer, but my heart rate was most of the race chilling mid to high 160s. And then I was touching 170 by an hour 40. So 2/3 into the race, I hit 170. And then the whole last third of the race, I was 170 or above pretty much. And that makes a lot of sense given that I was slowing down 10 to 15 seconds in that race. So part of me wonders if I was able to get to that 170 mark earlier in Indy, if I could have sustained that for the last 10K. I'm not sure, but that definitely makes me, I don't know how much I want to mess with these variables in future races where I'm trying to get PRs. Like if I really do think in a peak race I want to do the manual splitting thing, but it definitely makes me want to check my heart rate in race now to see where I'm at, because I feel like if I saw 163 to 165 in the middle of a marathon, I would have been like, you're not going hard enough, let's go. And it would have motivated me to push harder. Does that mean I might have blown up later? Maybe, but it maybe could have made up for that 30 seconds. I only maxed my heart rate at 174 at the end of Indy, and I maxed my heart rate in Chicago at 177. So again, felt like, and I knew the goal. I knew I wasn't going to hit the PR in the last 800 of Indy, so I don't think I really emptied the tank as much as I did in Chicago in that moment. Again, no cramping in Indy, and I cramped at 22.5 in Chicago. Another thing I noticed on Koros, because I was evaluating all the data, is that my stride length was consistent in all of Chicago. If I go to the stride length metric here, you could see when I started to struggle late in the race, I started to stride out a bit more because of those cramps. But you don't see any drop off in this chart. You can see, the pod 2 is recording this. You can see that my stride length is, between like 4 3/4 feet to almost 5 feet the whole entire race. But if I go to Indy, you can see there's obviously these spikes because of the downhills, but you see this whole section over here where I'm floating way closer to 4.5, which is really interesting. You can see it's much longer in the first 5 to 10K, and then it drops below that red average line in the tough miles. And it's interesting because I wonder if I mentally try to stride out more, if that would encourage me to go faster, or if that's just something that I'm doing and not realizing in those fading miles. Fascinating to look at. Obviously I'm a data nerd and want to always break it down very meticulously, but it felt really good to race with feel, not have to depend so much on doing math in my head the entire race. But yeah, in hindsight, the Sharpie on the arm was great, and I want to look at heart rate more moving forward with manual splits. The goal in the first half of my next race, I think, is going to be just don't go over 170 with heart rate for more than 2 miles at a time in the second half. So really trying to keep it in the 160s the first half, and then evaluating if I'm close to 170 or over 170, not making sure I don't go over that for more than 2 miles and cause a blow up. So many things to evaluate. I feel weird about doubling marathons now at this point. I said in the race video, like, they were a disaster for me, at least the first time when I did Chicago, New York. The Chicago CIM double last year was just meh, like ran 7 minutes slower. But this one was really interesting that I came so close to the PR. I think the reality was, given the variables in Chicago, I was closer to 232 shape, and the weather really affected me and pushed me closer to 234. And then Indy, I wasn't as fit, but the weather was a lot better. And, you know, if they were the same variables, I feel like it maybe would have been a 2 to 3 minute spread, with Indy being 2 to 3 minutes slower. But because it was so much cooler, I think that's why I ran only 30 seconds off. Just goes to show the marathon is it's so affected by those variables, especially weather. And you could play the game of evaluating all of it as much as you possibly can, but there's so many variables that you don't necessarily know which ones are causing which thing. But that's what's fun about it. And I hope you feel that way about marathoning as well. It's just I don't know, it's like Legos for adults. Like, you just have to figure out all these different pieces and try to perfect it with the circumstances you're given. And we're just going to keep going. So I don't know, that was chaos, all of that. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you can relate to some of it. I would love to hear your thoughts about any of those variables where you feel like I underperformed in either race, or what your insights might be if the shoes did affect me, what your thoughts are on Alphafly versus Elites. Any of those thoughts, please leave them down in the comments. Would love to discuss things more down there. And yeah, we got some fun stuff coming up this off season, and then we're going to be going hard for the spring race, which I don't know what the peak one is yet, but I'm sure I'll be announcing it in the coming months. Thanks for sticking around. For everyone that was at Indy, thank you so much for saying hi and all the encouragement. It was incredible. Thank you to everyone in Chicago and Indy for recording on the course. Like, these videos aren't possible without that extra coverage outside of Cyrus getting around the course. So thank you so much to you all. And it was a very fun fall racing season. Until the next time this idiot runs again, I'll see you there. Peace.